So today we have a special treat, and one of my favorite thought partners in the UK, Dr. Duncan Cross, is joining Pat and I to talk about narratives of failure and hope. Duncan is the head of School of Education at the University of Sunderland. Before that, he was an associate teaching professor in the School of Education and Psychology and the academic lead for education and program lead for the PG Cert Teaching and Learning in Higher and Professional Education at the University of Bolton. He wore many, many hats and learned many things, as well as led a series of initiatives that were always student-led, student-focused, and had a strong social justice trajectory. Duncan also teaches Masters in Education Pathways and supervises doctoral research students. He has a diverse background working in a range of higher education and further education contexts, including in China, teaching English and training teachers in the NHS system. Duncan is a highly decorated educational leader and teacher. He is a Natural Teaching Fellow. He's the Principal Fellow of Higher Education Academy, a Fellow for the Society for Education and Training, a Fellow for the Chartered Institute of Educational Assessors, and a member of the British Psychological Society. His research is reflective of his curiosity and deep creativity, and it ranges from matching expectations to learning and teaching in higher education, transitions in higher education, and refugee healthcare professionals. Duncan, thank you so much for joining us today and navigating both geographical and time zone constraints.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to join you.
Yay! So I know you very well and have been able to collaborate with you on so many different kinds of projects. But for our listeners, could you just tell us, and this is probably the hardest question we're going to ask, and it's unstructured, but can you tell us your story and talk a little bit about your journey to how you got here?
Sure. It's really interesting listening to the introduction because it's like, wow, that's my story, but there's so much messiness about my story. And I think people, when they come into academia, they think, right, I'm going to do my degree, I'm going to do my master's, I'm going to get my PhD, be tenured, and that isn't the route that I came through. I'm first in family for university, and I'm first in family for doctoral studies and working at university. I started off with a degree in psychology with international relations and thought that's what I was going to do. And things happened and changed, and I left the town that I was studied at university and moved to London, and I was waiting for a job to come up in psychology, and the funding got pulled, and I was in London and I needed to pay my bills, so I ended up teaching English as a foreign language. And I was doing that for about a year, and just as the funding for the psychology job came up, I was offered a job teaching in China. So I went to China because it's an adventure. What you're going to do? It's really interesting. Do you just stick with the normal, or do you think, oh, let's be brave and just go for it? So I just did it and went to China, where I ended up there for about 2 years. Came back to the UK and taught in the kind of private education sector for a couple of years, and then reached a limit and kind of you get comfy, and it's time to change. It's time to stretch yourself. So that's what I did, and I took a sideways step that paid the same money but with less responsibility, that just gave me more opportunities, and then moved into working for the NHS, or the National Health Service in the UK, working in medical education, teaching English initially to refugee healthcare professionals. So they were already qualified in their own country, but they had to go through a requalification or recognition system in the UK. And from there, I kind of moved into teaching clinical skills and clinical communication skills, and then really started to think about taking my career further, and that's when I ended up doing my PhD on refugee healthcare professionals. I then ended up on a leadership program, actually a clinical leadership program. I was one of their first non-clinical people in the program, and did a secondment in the frontline services, which was one of the most stressful jobs I've ever had in my life. Regularly starting with, you've got a patient that needs to go into surgery, but there are no beds, find a bed. So that was always the stressful part of the day. And then at that point, I'd finished all my corrections. So I was doing this secondment and I'd finished my corrections and got my PhD. And I was like, I really want to move back in education. It was a great secondment. It was a great opportunity. It gave me a real understanding of the NHS, but it was a short-term thing. And then I moved into international education. So I really, across my roles, I've used my degree, but not really thought about how I use my degree. And I'd done a postgraduate in health at the same time, as I was doing all of this. From there, I worked in international department and then moved into the education department as the program leader for our PG Cert, teaching and learning in higher and professional education, because I had the background of health and I had the background of education and bringing all of those kind of things through as well. And then I've kind of progressed in the role there, up kind of teaching professor, teaching research, action research, and then into a more management role, which is where I'm at the moment. So it's been all been quite messy. There's no been clear line of structure. That was not what I was about. I tend to just go with what happens. I have a bit of a plan, but sometimes, that doesn't always work out, does it?
And Duncan, as you sort of transition through this story, right, there seems to be a lot of like sort of great similar pieces to it. As you grew into more of an educational leader, do you think things changed for you from the educator perspective to the leadership perspective?
Yes, and I suppose that's a really tricky question, because I think it depends on where you are, and it depends on the group that you work with. Because one of the things I learned on my leadership program is you can lead from anywhere. You can lead from the bottom, you can lead from the middle, you can lead from the top. I think you can do that. And I think depending on your personality, you don't have to be forthright or strong. You just have to put your head above the parapet sometimes. And sometimes you have to take the hit, and sometimes people listen and you go with it. But if you don't voice your opinions or say things, then you can't lead. So sometimes it is about expressing your hope, your despair, and saying these things, because people do listen, and sometimes they're just waiting for someone to say something. Sometimes they don't want anyone to say something. You've really got to judge the room. And sometimes I don't judge the room right. Sometimes I say it and I think, oh, too late. That's one of my failings sometimes, but sometimes it's got to be said. People sometimes forget that we are all paid to do a job, and sometimes our job is to criticize and to say that's not quite right. And sometimes it's not to criticize, but it's to say we just need to think this question through. And if I don't ask the question, I've not done my job. So I do that a lot, I think.
Awesome.
So can I ask you a little bit, because Pat and I have had some back and forths about how sometimes transformative leaders, or what we understand traditionally as transformative leaders, whether that is distributed leadership or whatever theory you sort of follow, doesn't always set you up to be a good boss, which is upskilling for difficult and candid conversations, team management, emotional and intelligence skills of sort of performance review and assessment, and leading change when often people prefer the status quo. Transformative leadership to being a boss, some of those skill sets carry over, and some of them maybe have to be learned as you do that sort of boss version of leadership. Can you talk a little bit about maybe moments of failure, or one example of failure where you you realize, oh, right, I have to learn how to do this in different ways based on the context?
Yeah, I mean, there's tons of them. I think there's quite a lot of examples. I can think of cultural examples of kind of being in China and learning how the recruitment process that worked there was very different to the recruitment process that I was used to in the UK. And potentially that might have just been the boss that I worked for. And they were very much about, they were all about how healthy the person looked, not how good they were going to be at their job. And I was like, this is a problem, because I don't think this really healthy looking person is going to be able to do the job. And they're like, oh no, they can. And then 2 weeks later, we got the person that we really needed. But it was a real interesting learning thing. Sometimes you just have to roll with it. You can't control everything. You can't manage everything. But at the same time, sometimes you have to set up risk, and sometimes you have to create up safe risk. And I've found this with teams, and I think this is really interesting about the transformative and leading into being a boss, of managing that. When you create a safe environment for people to experiment and take risks, you have to be prepared to put a boundary in, because sometimes they don't realize there's a boundary, but there is a boundary sometimes. So that there's a safe risk, and we can take these risks in what we're doing pedagogically and try things. But actually, if your students are failing because of what we've done, we have to fix it, and you have to scale back pretty quick. So it's about being able to have those conversations, and those difficult conversations, I think, can be really difficult because they're difficult conversations. And one of the things that I learned was that I had to plan the conversation. So I couldn't just go in and say, we need to have a chat. I had to really learn that I need to sit down and think about the things that I want to put through in these points, and make sure that I had them in my head, so that these are the things that you need to learn about, and also accepting that things go wrong, and understanding that you can't always blame a person if the system's not set up for it. You can, if something goes wrong, I'm very much about, let's fix it. Let's not blame, let's fix it. And part of this comes from, working in a national healthcare system, or any healthcare system. It's an awful phrase, but the phrase that comes out of my mouth very often when something goes wrong and people are terrified is, has anybody died? Have you destroyed anybody's life? No. Then let's fix it. Let's take a step back. Let's look at the process. Let's go through. And then really going back and having a look at what went wrong and where it went wrong. And there's some of the things that you really have to reflect on. And sometimes we have to take the hit on. Sometimes it was our fault because we created this safe space for people to thrive. But really, we didn't put the right boundaries or limits in so that they could grow within a certain frame without hitting that critical point sometimes.
You've really brought up a great point there, Duncan, which Jessica and I have talked about before, around how, failure is truly, has someone died, right? And everything else is just growth on some sort of trajectory of made a few little mistakes here, learned from that, went along to the next thing. No one's died, so we're not at the full-on failure side of things. But there's a tremendous amount of vulnerability that one has to be open to, accepting of, sort of as a leader, as an educator, to see it like that. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
I think there's quite a lot in there. I think we very often see kind of things about what fail means, kind of this idea of first attempt in learning. I know Prof. Phil Race has talked about that, and I think there's lots of memes about it all over the internet and that kind of thing. So there is that thing about using failure as a learning point. And sometimes it's not a failure. We think about failing, but actually we're learning something. And I think sometimes we learn more from that than getting it right all the time. And I was talking to a colleague about this and talking about resilience, and saying that resilience comes from childhood. This is not something that we can necessarily teach at university, because when you first hear no, you can't have that, or your brother or sister says, no, you're not having my toys, and you have to deal with those things, it starts to build up resilience. And I think sometimes we are trying to be so safe with everybody and let people grow that we don't build in those buffers or natural boundaries for people to develop that kind of full range of emotions. Sorry, as I was talking about that, in my head, I got Harry Potter with Hermione saying, about the emotional range of a teaspoon. So there's this whole thing about developing that. Sorry, I've lost my thread. So Pat, I need to go back to your question.
Really?
I was just rambling. I got
that. I got a thread. I got the beautiful thread about resilience. Take me. Pick me.
It's just it. It
is. So your thread on resilience, right, on that learning from an early age, what happens when you hit up against boundaries and no's and failures and different ways of being in the world, and then understanding you can't necessarily teach it in higher ed because they've been learning it in some ways, both in positive, healthy ways, but also in some pretty negative and detrimental ways in all of our institutions, in all of our communities.
I think you're absolutely right there. I'm going to kind of pick up on this resilience and this thread about this safe environment. So one of the things that I used to do on the on our PG Cert Teaching and Learning, we have one of the first things I used to say to them, because they've got a year with me on the program, is this is your year to take risks. This is the year to experiment, and this is the year to try things and not worry too much, because you can blame me, because I've told you to. So if something goes wrong in your teaching, you can go back to your boss and say, well, Duncan told me. So that was always the thing of taking the edge off. And people would always come back to me and say, did you really mean it? And it's like, yes, because you've got to learn what works and what doesn't work. with different groups. So in higher education, if we don't take risks, we always do the same thing, we're always going to get the same results. And, you know, we're becoming very metrics driven, certainly in the UK. We're looking at lots of different things. And if you're always doing the same things and you can't see what's developing with the students, well, maybe you need to take a risk. But there's the danger that your exam results could drop. But on the plus side, if you plan it right, you speak to the right people and you really think about it, they could go the other way. But I think there's the other thing about people really not taking on sometimes that there's small losses or small negatives don't mean it's gone wrong. There's just something in there that we need to tweak. And I think when you learn to tweak those things and get past that and look at the bigger picture, it doesn't seem quite as anxiety inducing, because I think people can get overwhelmed with lots of the little things. I mean, you know, I think, was it the 90s, the Don't Sweat the Small Stuff, the book, the self-help book and all of those kind of things. They're right. Why are we sweating the small stuff? And I think one of the things that there's some real interesting articles kind of before COVID that come through, and Dilly Fung was talked about teaching excellence, and she talked about being good enough. And actually, sometimes the excellence is in our heads. So we go in and we do a lecture and the IT doesn't work quite the way that we want. So we walk out and we think we've done an awful, awful lecture. And it's like, no, those students learned everything that they needed to do, but the sound wasn't as great as you wanted it to be. That doesn't mean it wasn't excellent. It just means that it was good. It was good enough for those students. And I think there are days when we all have to recognize that we're going to have a bad day. Life happens. Work happens, there's lots of pressures, and sometimes you walk into a classroom and you're thinking, I can't give this 190%, but I can give it 100%. It's good enough. So sometimes it's about making being resilient in those approaches, because I know we all have colleagues that are perfectionists and want it to be perfect. It doesn't matter if it's not perfect. It really, really doesn't. And it's only as you come through this and you start, I think as a leader, sometimes you're having to sit down with colleagues and staff and saying, it doesn't have to be perfect. What you did was amazing. Was it exactly what you wanted? No. Did the students get what they needed out of this? Absolutely. So I think there's a lot about helping colleagues and building up that resilience as well. And I think that there's the difference as well between that leadership and management. And trying to be transformative with what we're doing, but linking back into that management where sometimes institutional systems really force us down a way of managing people that's inflexible, and that's not how we want to be. But sometimes we have to follow a process to support a colleague, because the process is there to make sure that there's no blame. So it's making sure that people understand that sometimes we're doing things not because we want to, but we can see there's a problem and we're trying to help you through a process. And I've seen this with colleagues kind of with health issues, and sitting them down and saying, I think you need to go to your doctor, you need to do this, or you need to speak to occupational health. And sometimes it's not, I think you need to, it's, I've booked you an appointment. You're going to speak to occupational health, because we have to look after people in different ways. And sometimes it's not about giving you an option in that management perspective, because it's looking at the holistic side of things. So if you've got a member of your team who's falling apart, your responsibility isn't just to that person, it's to everybody else on the team. So you're not my sole concern. If you're impacting negatively on everybody else, I have to contain you and get you well before you make other people ill. And that's a really hard thing to learn, because you might have a lot of concern for somebody personally because you like them, but you have to step back and go, you're hurting everyone around you, and I have to contain you. I have to put those that buffer period or buffer grade, whatever you want to call it, something in between you so that you can get well and move forward. And sometimes that works out and sometimes it doesn't. And I think one of the hardest things when you work with colleagues where it doesn't work out, you can take that really hard.
Yeah, I feel like the pandemic, if it's taught us nothing else, it's taught us some of these lessons, right? It's taught us 100% is good enough now when you're, in fact, 75% is good enough now when you're juggling the crazy world that we see around us. And so I think that notion of perception, but also the some of the language you were using, you know, you could substitute that for the public health playbook, right, around creating a bubble, and you know, so there's all the same language that hopefully we've learned, not just the language but the action as a result of this pandemic, so that we make our teaching and learning spaces in higher ed so much more human, right, instead of robotic.
I think the pandemic has helped reset a lot of people in their own heads about what they will and won't do, because I think we've all got on a bit of a treadmill about the system and promotion and tenure, and so we get on this and we just go for it because that's what's expected of us. And sometimes that's not what we want. Sometimes we just want to do our job, enjoy our job, and have a great life. We don't want all the other stuff that comes with it. But because it's expected of us, we end up on this track. And you're thinking, I don't want to be, why am I comparing myself to all these other people? They're doing great stuff, but do you know what? I'm really happy with what I'm doing. And so there's a certain level of confidence and resilience within yourself that you need to have to be able to recognize that I'm not competing against anybody else. The only person I'm competing against is me, because I've set my own internal barriers or posts that I've got to reach. And I think when you realize that in your head, sometimes that really helps your resilience to go, oh, actually, I can just stop just a little bit. I can take my foot off the gas. What was a friend used the phrase of, you don't need to drive it like you stole it. And sometimes, you know, people are doing that with their careers. They're driving their careers like they stole it. And it's like, you really didn't. Calm down, you know.
But we do this to ourselves, Duncan. You know, we set up systems and structures, and then we internalize those values, and then we reproduce them unreflectively. And then we wonder why we've burnt out, why we're stuck in spaces that are deeply unhappy, unhealthy, and unsustainable. And we look around and we're like, well, we can't blame the monolithic institution, the system. What does that mean? We're all members of the system. We're all agents of change within it. So I wonder, one of the things that I've been listening to and like fundamentally agree with all of the things you say, as per usual. But I want to change the lens slightly on the resilience, because I think that we have asked people to be resilient in increasingly deteriorating conditions. And that once we put that emphasis on the individual, that you have to get gritty, you have to bounce back, you have to build back better, you have to, you know, do all of this stuff. Academic buoyancy is my favorite, because I imagine holding somebody underwater and waiting for them. How long does it take them to pop up? Like, even the language here is of drowning people. What happens when we build systems where people don't have to be resilient? What would that system look like, where you have policies and structures and governance and working conditions where we don't have to have another conversation about individual grit, that we only have conversations about human flourishing? What needs to be in place for the system to create resilience so that individuals don't have to be?
I think that's a really interesting question, and I'm not sure I know the answer. I know that there's, I can think of places that I've really enjoyed working that have made me feel like that in some ways, and some of it is about values-based leadership and having values within an organization, because you can, you know what's happening, and you can have your stories around those values, and you know what direction you're going in. And I think sometimes, as much as we have some great leaders, sometimes we don't know who we are as institutions. And that's because some of us are young institutions, some of us are old institutions in terms of their maturity. And I think that can have a real impact on that feeling of resilience and confidence, because we have quality systems in the UK, and we have quality regulation, which is, I know it's very different in the States and Canada. You're kind of chuckling at me. But you see it with more mature and older institutions are less concerned about some of the things around quality, because they know they do it and they're confident. And they just, yeah, we're fine, we're confident. Whereas newer institutions are kind of, clamoring to, or younger institutions are clamoring to make sure that they're meeting these thresholds. And I think there is something about being confident in who you are and what you represent. And if you've got that confidence and you have the right systems in place and everybody knows where they're going, I think that makes it a better place to work. But I would say, again, I'm going to throw some things back to the individual, because I think there's a level of accountability about where you work, in that if you work in an institution that doesn't fit with your values, you have to make the decision to leave. Because if you don't, you create levels of tension that disrupt everybody else. And it's not that you're a bad person, but this isn't the right place. And I think what has happened, certainly I think in the past, is people kind of stay in institutions because of tenure and other things. But when you look at it, sometimes they think, why? I've come here and I'm not quite sure why, or this isn't the place I want to be. And there's all this tension that goes on outside of work that brings it into work, and there's competing interests. So I think there's lots of things that I think would be an amazing institution. I think there's a thing about kindness in there, and compassion for staff and for students. I think, there's been so much in the press about students and staff within HE during the pandemic, and you think, just give everybody a break, just take the narrative back, let's take a step back. It's not just the students who are working in cramped conditions with Wi-Fi that doesn't work. Guess what? There was a lockdown, there was a pandemic, everyone's working in those conditions. Did you really want to hear neighbour's dog barking all times of the day and night? No. But so there's those things about compassion and kindness, and just taking a step back and go, and really reflecting on, I'm not the only person affected. Because I think sometimes, and I think maybe this, I don't know if this is reflective of society, maybe I'm making generalizations, but there's a level of selfishness sometimes. And then it's all about me. And as long as I'm okay, it doesn't matter about anybody else. So I think there's this idea of community, kindness, compassion. I have a thing about compassionate rigor. And for me, this is about, I've worked with refugee healthcare professionals. These are people that have been through some horrendous conditions. So I'm going to be compassionate about their lives and what's going on. But my job was to get them through their education. So there were days when I'd say, okay, time to move on. And they'd be like, oh no, I'm not done yet. Yeah, you are. It's time to get through this door, because you're not staying here forever. Off you go. So it was that kind of sitting behind them and going, it's time to graduate. You can't do any more courses. You're done. Go away. Go get your life. And I think that sometimes we create these safe spaces that allow people to become too comfortable. And people like that. And I think sometimes people get angsty about when it's time to leave, and it's okay to leave, and it's okay to grow. And I think it's one of the things I think you can have in institutions, and I don't know whether you agree with this, is sometimes they become a bit like toxic relationships, because you get the whole gaslighting thing with colleagues and with about promotions and promises, and sometimes you just have to leave. It's not a bad thing. It's just you've grown past it. These things happen. Did that answer your question, Jessica?
It did. And I have this note that says quitting does not equal failure. And quitting is in fact something that helps human flourishing, and not just at the institutional level, the department level, or the team level, but also at the individual level. And I think going back to some insights that you had before about how if somebody is acting badly, to create a buffer around them and to say you're not just not flourishing yourself, but you're also affecting the team, is a kind of recognition of something I read in a tweet a couple of weeks ago that said, your institution, your workplace is not a family. A sports team is not a family. Becoming a member of a university is not a family, because a family has to give you unconditional love, or depending on what family you're from, toxic guilt. But you're not a family. And to frame it that way is to be disingenuous. You have loving, respectful, clear, boundary driven relationships about individual and team flourishing, and to make it so deeply personal or attach it to a different kind of unit like a family is to actually do people a great disservice, because then they feel like if I leave, everything will fall apart, or if I leave, I'm irreplaceable. And an institution doesn't love you back. An institution actually is not an animate being. An organization is not an animate being. And the organization's interest is to maintain and sustain its operations. So it actually doesn't at all notice, even if you're like, I am the heart of this organization, you're not. And so that, for me, I think that was one of the big light bulb moments I had about, I want to say a decade ago, but it's a lesson I keep learning, is you're replaceable always. That doesn't mean you're not valued, but an institution itself cannot, nor should you expect it to love you back, because that will actually hurt your resilience, and it can hurt the team and different kinds of systems.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that tweet you talked about, quitting is not failure. I think that's really important, because that kind of goes into where I think we're all really good at reflection. Sometimes it's not reflection, it's over-analysis and can't get out of your head. But I think there's something about reflection and how we reflect. And you ask people, so what model do you use? And they go, well, I just reflect and I just think about it. I'm like, well, okay, so tell me more about it. And people don't always understand what they're doing when they're reflecting. And sometimes they don't understand that they're doing it all the time. People are cooking and tasting food, and you're reflecting on what you've done, and you're making small changes. And it's this inaction, on action, and shone. But then you've got things when people reflect. And one of the really interesting things that I do is I kind of flip back to Gibbs and say, well, so how did you feel when that happened? No, I don't talk about my feelings. Let's go back to that, because I think you need to talk about your feelings, because I think sometimes people get really angry with themselves about quitting, and they're not quitting. They've reflected on a situation and gone, this is not working. This is not the right course of action. Just because you're quitting does not mean that it's failure, or you've reflected and gone, this is not right. This is about making the right decisions for you. And I think you sometimes see this with students where they're completely on the wrong program, but they've been guided by other people because that's the program that they want to do. And you're thinking, no, okay, you're not quitting, you're resetting. So there's a whole thing about that reflection and thinking about that, but ignoring our feelings is really difficult. I think going back to kind of this idea of safe space, and I was talking about before in taking risks, you have to think about the feelings in there, about how did I feel when I taught this group, or when I did this thing? Was I excited? Was I thrilled? Was I terrified? Did it make me really anxious? Because if it makes you really anxious, you probably shouldn't be doing it until it makes you feel excited to do it. So it's thinking about those things of when you're teaching and you're working with colleagues, how do you feel? And we talk about this, about when you've got students that might be aggressive, and they talk about how they're really aggressive, or something happens. I'm like, so how did you feel? I'm like, well, I don't know. Well, let's think about how you feel, because that will have dictated your action in the moment. If you were really angry, you might have responded back in the same way, which isn't necessarily helpful. But it's about learning to notice these small things and reflecting appropriately to make the right decisions for you. Because I think we can talk about resilience and people being resilient, but actually, and all of those kind of things, like we say, it's not about people being resilient. If an institution is overworking a person, you can put them on as many resilience courses as you want. They're still going to be overworked and they're still going to be stressed. And actually going back to that feeling is, how do you feel? I feel stressed. I feel angry. I feel anxious. I can't do the best that I'm doing. Digging down into all these kind of things all of a sudden opens up a narrative and a story about what more is going on. And I think sometimes that's a real trick of leadership, of knowing when to do that, because sometimes you have to think, I can't do this today because this is going to happen, or these students need to be dealt with. Let's do it after here. Because if I ask that, sometimes with some colleagues, you don't ask them how they are today. You just know you don't, because if you do, the floodgates are going to open and they're about to go teaching. So you wait until they've done their teaching, and then they come out and you've got a cup of coffee and go, so how are you today? And that's, it's about appropriate timing sometimes, and letting people work through and deal with things on their own time as well, but giving them that power to do that and saying, actually, I know sometimes you don't want to talk, but you know where I am. And sometimes that's what people need. They don't want to tell you everything that's going on in their life, but here's a coffee. Do you want to go and talk about something else? And sometimes that's more important because they just want some normalization of what's going on, or normal conversation. So sometimes, there is this thing about resilience. Sometimes it's quite annoying. We've seen a lot of it when they're saying, oh, let's put yoga classes on. Yeah, you can do, but I won't be there because I'm too busy marking. Because, I've got all these students. So it's great that, institutions are trying to help with health and well-being, but actually, are they really helping with health and well-being? It's just something else that I feel like I've got to do because you're going to tell me you've spent all this money on it and wasted it because I didn't turn up.
Something else that you couldn't attend.
Absolutely.
So Duncan, this is a sort of perfect segue. This is how does Duncan feel about, in relation to teaching and learning and higher ed? What is it that gets you out of bed in the morning, or what is it that keeps you up at night that is like the primary concern that you just can't shake? Maybe these are the same thing. Who knows?
For me, what gets me up is my colleagues. It's absolutely supporting my colleagues and supporting the students and making sure that they're doing their best and helping them to do their best. What keeps me up at night is that we're not doing it enough, or there's somebody that slipped through the cracks. I think they're the things that sometimes keep you up. But I think within that, I've learned a long time ago is there's only so much you can do. And I think there's an increasing thing in higher ed, and there was something, I can't remember the lady's name that did it. She did a chart that showed all the things that a lecturer and academic does, and this wheel just keeps getting bigger and bigger, and the types of roles that we do. If you think about what it was to be a lecturer 20, 30 years ago, and what it is now with the social responsibility and care and pastoral care and counselling, and we're moving into multiple roles within a job, and I think that keeps me up about how my staff are going to cope and my team are going to cope. We have students with increasing mental health issues. We have staff with increasing mental health issues because they don't know how to deal with the students with increasing mental health issues. And I think there's not enough recognition of what do we do to support our staff. I think, in some professions, certainly in psychology and counselling, certainly in the UK, you would have a supervision session where you could offload all these kind of issues about how have I dealt with these right. So you would have that support. Our lecturers don't get that. Our lecturers are dealing with students that are talking about suicide, about abuse, about so many different things. They're worried, what's keeping their students up at night. And then our lecturers go and they churn it around in their head. And our institutions don't support them in that. They talk about them being more resilient, and you think, yeah, you go and deal with those things.
Yeah, when all they have is, oh, I remember there's a phone number to refer students to about that if I hear about it, but no support structure.
No, and if I get another Wellness Wednesday email or another email about hot chocolate in the quad as the world is burning, I'm going to scream, and I'm going to scream into the abyss, because it is so tone deaf right now that institutions, we've got this hilarious thing at our institution where there's a wellness day. It's for staff, not for faculty. But they give everybody the day off and then force them, this was before COVID, to hang out with one another and go golfing or go do yoga. And I'm like, you know what they could really use? A day not hanging out with you all. Like a day just staring into the middle distance and letting their eyes go blurry and just trying to figure out what has just happened to us. And I just think, there is such an interest for our institutions and for many of our leaders to rush back to normal, because normal in their formulation will mean that it doesn't hurt as much, that we'll get to erase that hurt. We'll get to erase the grief and despair. And yet one of the healthiest ways, this is how I understand critical hope, is to sit in that despair and to give space for grief and to process what I think we have, which is unprocessed grief over the last 2 years. But I think it extends before COVID into the ways in which we navigate inhospitable systems, structures that are not designed to be welcoming, inclusive, diverse, and just. So I wonder, and Duncan, you are one of the most hopeful, gritty, creative, bounce back humans. But could you talk to us a little bit about the despair or the grief? Like, what happens when inevitably all of your critical reflection and all of your compassionate rigor and all of the skills that you have, when it still hurts and you want to howl into the abyss? How do you do that? What does it look like? And how do you move into future facing spaces?
I think it's really tricky because we all have experiences of different things and kind of systems that get us through. I tend to give myself a time limit and treat it, like, okay, I've got a day. I can be angry for a day. I can be or I can have a really bad day, but I've got to pick it up and crack on. And this is very much this is my grandmother, that I still remember her in my head, bless her. And it was very much about, yeah, right, time to move on. You've got to kind of, at some point, you have to move on, because if you don't, you'll just sit there and can't move on and become incapacitated about it. So when I was at university, I had a car crash. A water van drove into the back of my little Fiat Panda, which is this tiny little box thing, and squashed the inside of my car. And I had terrible back pain, and I ended up getting involved in something called Reiki, which is a spiritual system in some respects, and in others they talk about this idea of hands-on healing and all of those kind of things. But they have this mantra, and it's really, really positive, because there's 5 principles, and it's all about just for today. Just for today, don't get angry. Just for today, don't worry. Just for today, do your work honestly. Just for today, be grateful or have gratitude. And just for today, be kind to all living things. And I tend to including yourself. You have to be kind to yourself. But very often it's compartmentalizing it. It's just today. Because if you can't get beyond that, then it becomes a week or a month or a year. And then you don't know how to get out of it. And I think there's there is a thing about we live every day, and we have to take each day at a time. Sometimes we just have to move through that day as it is and not worry about some of the other stuff, because I can't do anything about some of the other stuff. So you just have to take what you can and go, okay, so this is what I can deal with. I mean, there's some horrible things going on in the world right now, and a friend of mine was trying to have a conversation with me about it, and I was like, I can't engage with it right now. And it's not that I don't want to, but I have too much other stuff. Speak to me at 6 o'clock, because right now, this is what I'm dealing with. I'm dealing with the students and their issues, and that's taking all the bandwidth in my head to deal with and to make sure that they're safe. So I think sometimes it's about learning what your limits are and saying, this is what I can do right now. What's the important stuff? What's not important? And how can I move forward? Sometimes I'm really good at that, and sometimes I'm terrible. And that's all right. We have really good days and bad days. And I think when we've all sat there, we've got a list, and you look through it and you think, I've done none of those things today. That's fine. Have I killed anybody? Is the world going to burn or fall apart? No, I can do it tomorrow. And sometimes we one of the things I think sometimes with the academy and higher education is we do get filled with our own self-importance sometimes. And it's like, yeah, it really doesn't matter if I do that right now. It's going to make no difference whatsoever. That report that's got to be in, that no one's going to read for another month. Hey, come on, let's, be sensible about this and really think about what pressure am I putting myself under to get these things done, because the pressure is very often coming from us. Yes, there is external pressures of this is a deadline, but I'm the one saying, oh, yes, I want to do that. And yes, I want to do that. And oh, that's shiny. Can I do that too? So I think there is something in there as well. Did that answer the question? Sorry, Jessica.
Go ahead, Jessica.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I think that, what can I do today? And what is my bandwidth, especially when you're managing emotional labor, which is oftentimes invisible. We don't back to that. How are you feeling? We don't align our emotional, spiritual, cognitive, and physical selves. We don't bring our whole selves to the academy because the academy doesn't invite our whole selves in. And as I imagine Hope University building resilient systems so individuals don't have to be, I imagine, what does that look like in an everyday? What does that look like to make that emotional labor visible and valued? And maybe you don't get those reports or those to-do lists checked off, but if you made somebody feel better, more whole, listened to, heard, supported, or joyful, that for me is the value. And that's why we came. That's why we got called to this space. And that is, I think, something we don't make visible or valued very well in our institutions.
No, we don't. But effectively, we're all working in higher education for the better of society. And if we're teaching track as well, and very much teaching track, you're there for the students. You're there to make their world better. You're there to make society better because you're teaching your students. That is why you're there. And sometimes it's very easy to lose sight of that. What are we there for? We're there to make the world a better place in various ways. But what we sometimes need to remember is that humanity of making it a better place. We don't need to be mean to make it a better world. We don't need to be savage. Because I think sometimes people think they're being really witty and clever, and actually you're just being savage. You've just crossed a line. There's no need for that.
Yeah.
Let's just take it back. Let's think about this as nice and human. And I think, you know, there's you can talk about toxic positivity and toxic cultures, because I think sometimes people think, oh, it's banter. And sometimes you think, no, it's not. That's not banter. That's just pure nastiness and making yourself feel better and feeding your own ego. There was no need to do that. And I think one of the things that I think people forget about, and I've been thinking about this in terms of threshold concepts, of when you go to conferences, there is an assumption that everyone has walked through the same portal or the same threshold concept. And that's not true. We've all come at it from different lenses. We've come at it from different cultures, from different training. So whilst everyone in the room might have a PhD or a certain level of training, that's something we're all looking at it the same way. And sometimes people in the room forget that. So if you don't have the same view or the same opinion, they can really go on the attack, and you think that's not the way. No, this isn't about this. And I think I've probably done this myself when I've gone to a conference, and I think we've probably all done it. And we've sat in a thing and gone, why are you talking about this? This was being talked about 10 years ago. And then you sit back and you go, you've come from a different place. This is relevant to you right now. I'm really interested to see where you go. But it's getting that reflection in your head and not thinking I'm wasting my time. It's thinking, oh, I thought this 10 years ago. Are they going to go down the same path I thought? And oh, I'd love to have a chat with them about those kind of things, rather than going on the attack on those things as well. So it's interesting, I think.
And that's critically important. I think we walk that fence line between entitlement and insecurity, right? And sometimes it's very difficult to tell which side are they on. Are they tearing this down because they feel like they're entitled to do that, or because they're insecure about what's being talked about?
Yeah. Well, Brene Brown, I've been listening to her podcasts and painting, and she talks about the scarcity model. So when you're in an institution where you never have enough blank, we never have enough people, we never have enough students, we never have enough programs, we never have enough money, we never have enough staff, we never have, right? You start to say, we never have enough, I'm not enough. And when you start to internalize, I am not enough in a scarcity model, you bake shame into the walls, and shame does not stay in the walls. Shame seeps out. And as you say, Duncan, it seeps out by people being savage, thinking they're being funny, inside jokes, witticisms, being precocious, entitled. But that is because shame is baked into the walls. Let's stop blaming the salmon and let's start blaming the dam. That's a very, very Canadian metaphor. But, you know, we're creating the conditions for people to act badly. And furthermore, we are not skilled enough to have those difficult conversations, to pull those boundaries in, to reset those social norms, and to establish basic respectful communications and team building. And so I'm pretty empathetic about humans who are, as Pat said, actually really lacking confidence and then unreflectively reproducing bad behaviors because of the systems in place that have baked shame into the walls to begin with.
I think it's really interesting, that baking shame, because this goes back to this, what I was saying before about institutions being confident about quality and younger institutions not being, because I think there's the same thing about their quality and everything that they do. You can get graduates from really good universities that have gone in with really good qualifications, come out with really good qualifications, but where's the added value in there? Sometimes there's no added value. They've just gone through the process. And then you get institutions that have taken people that are, would be classed as failures. I mean, I didn't particularly do well in my kind of what we would call our A-levels or 18 leaving exam, but I've certainly done well after that. And I think people forget that people change. People aren't always ready for schools. I mean, I work in what we would class as widening participation universities, where they might be first generation coming to university. So they haven't had the support or the educational support that would help them into higher education. But you know what? I love teaching them. I absolutely love teaching them, because they're the ones you see the light bulbs going off in their head about what's changed and how they're going to change the world. Whereas sometimes I've worked in other universities that are classed as more elite, and some of the students, you think, wow, you have no idea what's going on in the world, or what's going on, or why people feel like that way, because you have no other worldview. You've not seen things, or you've not experienced things. And that's just a real perception of where people are. We don't all have to go to university when we're 18. But that's a path that's been set for so many to get themselves into a tremendous amount of debt in some places. When actually, go work for a couple of years, figure yourself out, figure out what you really want to do. It doesn't have to be that way. But again, that I think expects a level of bravery, because sometimes that doesn't agree with what other people want around you. So I think sometimes you do have to be brave and go out and find out where you want to be and who you want to be in the world, which is not an easy thing to do. And it's just not easy. There's so many barriers out there. And I think it's got harder, and COVID hasn't helped. I think, it's set people back a couple of years, everybody back. But, I think it set all of us back as adults, as well as, children and young adults. So I think there's that whole thing about the idea of what does hope look like. It's about that, for me, it's that kindness and compassionate kind of action, or just being respectful of people, I think is a really interesting point. We can disagree, but we can disagree respectfully. We don't have to be kind of out for each other with knives in the back, because you see that, and it's just like, do we need the politics? Is it necessary? So I suppose I hope university would be not devoid of politics, but reduced somewhat.
I love that. Yeah, that there's always going to be candid conversations in contested spaces with deep disagreement. And if we take that as a failure or as a flaw of the system, then we set ourselves up for contestation that is conflict, and then creates entrenched, polarized perspectives. And you're never going to meet in the middle, much less transcend that together into a higher plane of being and learning. So, I think that that's a beautiful way to end this conversation and to take us into future facing spaces as we imagine Hope University. It is not without conflict, but it is upskilling with the compassionate rigor and the critical reflection and the sort of resilience both of systems and of humans to imagine better and more humane and more human-centered organizations. And I think that you've just given us a beautiful roadmap for that, Duncan, and the roadmap, back to your metaphor of like, let's not drive this car like we stole it. Let's use this roadmap to think intentionally about where we want to go and how we want to take people along with us. So So thank you so much for joining us tonight, your time zone, and giving us some really amazing insights to take into our own contexts.
Thank you so much for having me and setting these questions off and making me think about these things as well. It's a really great opportunity. So thank you.
Thanks, Duncan. It was a pleasure.
Fantastic. Thank you.